3 judge from Raleigh, North Carolina. I am the Mid-Atlantic Regional Coordinator, and I am a diehard Boston Red Sox fan. If there is any pro-Denver Broncos sentiment expressed in the seminar, you will be asked to leave, and you will be decertified with prejudice. Am I joking? So, folks, my goal in this seminar is twofold. My motivation for presenting on this specific topic was because I hate the missed trigger policy. I have always hated the missed trigger policy. It is the most specific, the most nuanced, and possibly the most obscurely worded part of policy in the IPG, past, present, or future. As such, my policy knowledge, even as a level 3 judge, even as someone who's been judging for almost a decade, is not as good as I feel comfortable with it being. So when David called for applicants, for presenters for this conference, I wanted to step up and teach all of you this thing that I'm really bad at, in hopes that collectively we can suck less. So before I get started, just a couple ground rules. First off, one person talks at a time. If that's me, great. If it's not me, it's one of you. If it's one of you, it's not 3 of you. Second, if you want to play EDH, if you want to play Candy Crush Saga, if you want to sort out bulk rares to sell me later, all of these things are fine, but please don't do it during my seminar. If you want to be somewhere else, I totally respect that. There are a lot of great seminars going on today, but please don't be that guy. With that said, thank you very much for being here. Let's get started. So, when we're talking about missed trigger policy, there are 3 main sections on which I want to touch. Damn it, Bears! No, you don't. No, you don't. It's not reciprocal. So, there are 3 main things that I'd like to unpack for you. The first is the philosophy and some of the terminology behind what our policy is. The second is a discussion on the idea of awareness and what that means. There are different ways of being aware of something depending on what the card is. Let me say that again for you. There are different ways of being aware of something depending on what the card is. Yeah. The third thing that we're going to unpack is how to resolve triggers when they are in fact missed. So, any questions before we get started? Sweet. So, there are approximately 8,763,524.2 cards in Magic with missed triggers. They are a very common and a very important part of how we play the game. Some of the best cards in the game have missed trigger, have triggered abilities in one way or another. Primeval Titan, Avenger of Zendikar. Obviously, I play a lot of EDH, Bitter Blossom, Stoneforge Mystic. You can't play Magic competitively without having some kind of awareness of what missed triggers are. Players get very easily confused by missed triggers. How many of you have competed in a PTQ at any point in your Magic playing career? It is, so you feel me when I say this, Magic is a really hard game to play well. It is incredibly hard. I stand before you as a man who got 3 separate game rule violations at a GP, all of which were self-reported. And I'm a level 3 judge. I'm supposed to be an expert on how these things work. And I got a game loss because Undiscovered Paradise is not worded correctly. At any rate. So, the point I'm trying to get across here is Magic is an incredibly complicated game, and missed triggers are a very integral part of that. They are incredibly common. Has anyone here gotten a warning for missing a trigger? Show of hands. And you're all judges? Real? I can't work with this. So when we're dealing with mistriggers as a part of policy, we are inclined to be lenient and forgiving. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not drawing extra cards. This is not something which will give you, and yes, I did just conflate the Cuban Missile Crisis with DEC, just so we're clear for the folks recording this. This is a very common and very forgivable part of policy. So the infraction that we give for mistrigger is always warning. Can someone give me the upgrade path for warning? So you have to miss a trigger 3 times. Does it have to be on the same card? Just the same infraction? And your third one's a game loss. You have to screw up 3 times before we end the game on you. Now, unless you're a player of my caliber, this is not a thing you should be doing on a regular basis. So, please. It is in the same tournament. In the same tournament, on the same day. If you are a much better player than I am and make day 2 of a GP, we give you a clean slate on the second day. But I digress. Thank you for pointing that out there. So, yes, please go ahead. I'm sorry?
How is the detrimental trigger upgraded to a game loss faster? If you get a detrimental trigger, don't you lose the game loss faster?
I'm going to answer your question in 13 minutes, okay?
Okay.
Awesome. So, when you are playing a game of Magic, there are 2 types of triggers. There are yours, and there are mine. I can miss my triggers accidentally, and I don't have to care about your triggers, but I cannot intentionally miss one of my own triggers. Alaric, if I miss one of my own triggers, what infraction am I committing? Yes. Cheating fraud. If you deliberately miss a trigger on one of your own cards, you will be excused from the tournament. However, if my opponent controls Honden of... Does anyone remember Honden of Cleansing Fire? That obnoxious cycle of cards that broke judges' hearts for years? So, if Chris McGuire has a Honden, and he and I are battling in EDH, and he's just completely derping and missing every trigger, I don't have to say a damn thing. He doesn't have to gain that 2 life. Forget it. There is nothing wrong with allowing your opponent to miss one of their triggers, unless you want them to remember it. Frank, if you and I are playing, and, well, I play robots in Modern, but let's say you're playing John, and I have you on 1 life, and you have a Dark Confidant, and you draw your card for the turn. Can I make you resolve your Bob trigger? Yes, I can. I can make Frank possibly lose the game. This is as far as my responsibility goes when it comes to missing triggers. I can't intentionally remember mine, and I can let you remember yours all day long. Yes, sir. The question is, can you intentionally let someone miss their triggers? The answer is unequivocally yes, you can. You do not have to play the game for your opponent. If your opponent is me, you definitely don't want me playing the game, your game for you, but even if you're playing a better player, you don't have to play the game for them. So, one assumption that we have is that a trigger is remembered. We assume that you play these cards for a reason, and that you will remember them at the appropriate time. We allow you to be somewhat slippery with when you actually demonstrate awareness of that trigger. And we'll touch on that in just a little bit. But one of the key pillars of our philosophy here is we assume that you are going to remember your triggers. What about your opponent's triggers? If, I don't know, let's say Chris is a very good player, Well, Chris is a better player than I. Chris is a better player than I am. So let's say Chris and I are playing, and he attacks with a Knight of Infamy, 2-1 with Exalted. And he says take 3. That's okay. But if he says take 2, that's also okay. So yeah, if Chris has Knight of Infamy and he attacks, and I have Jace Architect of Thought that I +1 last turn, the number of answers that could be given here are ridiculous. I'll let you think about that one for a minute. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Anyway, 5 is out. 5 is straight out. If you think that your opponent has missed a trigger, you have 2 options, really. Your first option is to assume that they have remembered it and act in whatever manner you believe is the most optimal play for you in that scenario. Your second option is to ask for clarification. Chris, what is the power and toughness of that Knight of Infamy you're attacking me with? 2-1 with Exalted on the stack. All right, I guess I'm taking 3. Minus the 1. That was a bad example to give. So if you think your opponent has missed something, you can act optimally, or you can ask for clarification. If you try to get into a nitpicky, highly semantic, makes me want to throw you out of the tournament discussion about, well, he picked up his pen, so he missed it. You're going to make me sad. I am much more prone to issuing infractions when I am sad. So don't do that. You also can't push your opponent through a trigger. If your opponent controls a card that triggers during your upkeep, you can't just go, untap, draw, gotcha. You can't do that. The opponent can say, well, hold on there, Tonto. We got to get this trigger here out of the station first. Hold on. And that's okay. You cannot rush your opponents into mistakes. Yes, Jeff? Go to hell. Now, Desecration Demon is a prime example of this. Let's say Alaric and I are playing, and I go, play my land, bash you for 6 with Desecration Demon. You go, I'd like to resolve this trigger, please. It is perfectly within Alaric's right to do so. And he can sacrifice his Sapperling token, or well, you probably play Mono Blue Devotion.
I don't.
Well, for this example, you do. So you can sacrifice your elemental token and lock down my Desecration Demon. I cannot force you to miss my trigger, and I cannot force you to miss your trigger by pushing the game state around.
Should I call the judge?
Yes. You should definitely call for a judge. Anytime something seems kind of squirrely, you should call for a judge. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? We're good? Awesome. Another thing... Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
I didn't talk about the GP. Basically, I know that you're not too focused on your opponent's triggers, and that triggers only miss when an opponent gives an indication that they missed the trigger.
Yes.
I had this happen. A player attacked with the offline of one tutor that gets +1 for heroic or whatever. Another day, 2 for 1. Whenever you have to you're actually judging that guy on turn 2. So he plays out on turn 1. Turn 2, he attacks and gives it +2/+2 on one of the white things. That says take 4.
Okay.
But then fails to put a +1/+1 counter on it after passing the turn.
Okay.
Now, he obviously indicated that he knew that it was getting a counter, but he also didn't actually.
Did everybody hear that example?
He made an indication that he was using it, but didn't give that indication.
Sure. So, a Crow and a Hoplite targeted with Battlefield Valor, take 4, doesn't put the counter on it. Has the player demonstrated awareness of the trigger? Okay. What has the player actually done here? Oren.
It's just sloppy representation. We don't strictly require that players use counters to represent things that they don't use counters for. But if it's not clear to both players what's going on, then they should make it clear.
Jeffrey.
When you are judging an event, if you are seeing
That's a different card. That's the blue-white one. There's 2/2 scry, and then there's a crow and hoplite, which is what? Favored. Okay, yeah. Well, I'm going to exercise my hand wave ability on that one. So, Oren raises an excellent point here. Sloppy misrepresentation, or sloppy representation, is not a crime here. There is no section in the IPC for sloppy representation. It's just make it clear, get on with your life.
Players are required that the game state be clear to everyone.
Right.
If a player says that they don't want to put counters on their features,
If the player, this is kind of tangenty, but suffice it to say that if you and I are playing a match and we agree on a method of representing the accurate power and toughness of my creature that doesn't involve putting a dice or a bead or an M&M, because I eat those things all the time, on the top of my creature, that's okay. It's whatever is mutually agreeable between you and I. If you don't want to and I say, damn it, we're going to do it this way, and I call a judge, the judge is probably going to side with me. Fair? Okay. So, he did not miss the trick. So the last thing I want to talk about on our basic assumptions and philosophy before we move on to awareness is out-of-order sequencing is a thing that can apply here. So, for example, if I'm playing Chris again, because I like Chris, he's a fun guy, he's the friendliest Canadian I've ever met. Let's say Chris and I are playing and he goes, untap, draw game 2 from Honda. Again, untap, upkeep, draw game 2 from Honda. Has he actually missed the Honda trigger? No, but he drew his card already. So, didn't he miss the trigger?
Under the new rule, will read the triggers because they've only changed 12,000.
12,003 actually.
Trigger's not missed. It's the first time that it affects.
Right. We're going to get into that in awareness. Yeah. Yeah.
If you set it all at once with one message, say it was part of it just out of order sequencing and the player is trigger and he absolutely is.
That's an interesting question. That's also an interesting question. So, sorry, go ahead. So on the one hand, we are in a different phase of the game. Or we're in a different step of the game. We're in the draw step now. You can't resolve upkeep stuff during the draw step. On the other hand, out-of-order sequencing is also a thing.
And we also, one thing to be careful of while you're doing that around procedures is don't make it uncomfortable.
Possibly. For the sake of
Around one match where they're kind of pressing in.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, go for it.
So, because he demonstrated awareness immediately, so he clearly hasn't forgotten the trigger. He's not getting any extra information by drawing the card before he gains 2 life instead of after he gains 2 life. So this is acceptable out of order sequencing.
Ask everyone to take one step back. Give the players a space. It's a good thing to give the players who are actually playing.
You can't do anything during the untap phase except untap your card. Before we get on a happy train to derailed conversationville, out-of-order sequencing is very much a part of mistrigger policy. And if that happened in a tournament, if it was untap, upkeep, draw, gain 2, all in one fell swoop, that's fine. That is totally fine.
If the game state is abusable by one player, let's say they wanted to do something before you in response to like
Yep.
no action like
Yes.
then you would consider just calling let's say I hope you're gonna forget your trigger. If you actually put the trigger on the stack, I wouldn't do it. I would change the dynamics again with skull crack. If
So-
you actually remembered it.
Did everybody hear Alaric's question? So the question was, if I was going to respond to you gaining the life, do we just call it a missed trigger at that point? Part of out-of-order sequencing is if in the out-of-order sequencing a player wants to intervene at any point such that it's legal, they can do that. So yes, in that case, you can say, oh, well, we're going to gain 2 life, back it up, skull crack you. And that's fine.
So since he's probably hard to end up calling the head judge in.
Yeah, you could arguably put a random card back on top, resolve the trigger properly, then draw the card. You and I would not. So, out of order sequencing is, to some degree, a subjective policy. It really depends on how the player is going about what they're doing. So, I hate to lean on this crutch, but I'm going to say it depends. And we're going to move on to awareness now. Yes. So we're going to move on to awareness now. I appreciate all the interaction. I hope we get more of it during awareness. Because this is such an intricate and complex part of policy, there are infinite permutations and infinite questions that we can ask about it. Awesome. Awareness. So, when a trigger is involved in a judge call, one of the first things that we have to do is determine whether or not the player was aware of the trigger. And if so, did they demonstrate the awareness of that trigger at the appropriate time? So, let's say, for example, I have a triggered ability that says, at the beginning of my upkeep, tap target creature. When do I have to demonstrate awareness of that trigger in order for it to be okay?
Sometimes you got to have to demonstrate awareness. Sometimes before you either change phase by obviously drawing a card or resolving a bunch of other.
Okay. So let's say I have this mythical trigger, and so during my upkeep I go brainstorm during my upkeep. You respond by red blasting it. I respond by force of willing it. We resolve force, we resolve which counters red blast, we resolve brainstorm, and then I say tap your Tarmogoyf. Is that okay? Show of hands. Who says that's okay? Who says that's not okay? Why is it not okay? A trigger that involves a target, for any trigger that involves a target, demonstrating awareness means that you choose a target before you would next pass priority. So if, for example, you were to say, you have a, let me see, is there a heroic trigger? There's a heroic trigger that taps something. Yes, I drafted 3 of those last night. It sucks. It does. So let's say I go main phase. Battlefield Valor, retain priority, Battlefield Valor, retain priority, instant that gains me life. Oh, and by the way, tap that and tap that. Holding priority the whole time. Is that okay? Is everyone clear on what is that, show of hands, is that okay? Show of hands, is that not okay? Okay. When we are dealing with, because passing priority is the important demarcation point for missed triggers that have targets in them, if I indicate that I'm retaining priority in a batch of actions and in that batch of actions announce that I'm choosing my targets now, policy supports that as being okay. Or any of you seem to...
You're supposed to declare the target before you would gain priority again, not before you.
You know, you might be right. Give me 1 second.
The first game of my first match, I heard it on Zenith, and guess where?
The choices, so this is the actual section of policy. A triggered ability that requires the controller to choose targets other than target opponents, modes, or other choices made when the ability is put on the stack. The controller must announce these choices before they next pass priority. So if you retain priority in that batch, it is fine for you to go ability, 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 oh, by the way, heroic trigger, pass. Jeffrey. Right. When you put an ability or spell in the stack, you are assumed to pass priority unless you explicitly state otherwise. Philosophically, it's reasonably consistent without overseas. So yeah, I would say so.
You have to make it clear that you're taking priority.
Yes, you must. One of our commonly assumed shortcuts is that if you take an action, you're immediately passing priority afterward. If you wish to deviate from the shortcut, you must state that you are doing so at that time. So if I go bolt you, bolt you, bolt you, bolt you, well, first I'll just bolt you 5 times, which is illegal, and you should probably call the judge. But bolt you, bolt you, bolt you, bolt you, incinerate you. That's fine so long as I explicitly state that I'm holding priority. Fair enough? Awesome.
On that, would you say I'm holding priority after that? After your judgery, or
These are your new friends.
Or before you start.
If you say what?
Do you repeat the question?
well, you were saying that if you go bolt, incinerate, you say I'm holding priority after you say incinerate, or are you saying bolt priority, bolt priority?
If you take a batch of actions, you say like bolt, 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 hold. You're probably going to say hold priority before you start throwing bolts, but again, it depends. To be clear, folks, I'm going to give you as much concrete information as I possibly can and as many honest answers as I possibly can. There are some situations where I'm going to have to say it depends, because unless we're getting into role plays, which is not part of what this seminar is about, you're going to have to do that really scary thing that even high-level judges are sometimes loath to do. Use your judgment. If you have made it through a judge exam, we trust that you know how to make decisions on things. For some people, that's probably not wise, but in general, we trust you to make decisions. You had something you wanted to say.
I was going to say a good rule of thumb in those cases is there a likelihood that I'm going to miscommunicate with my opponent? If so, be proactively, yes.
Yes. Everything that I've said thus far and everything that I'm about to say to you is obviated if you communicate well with your opponents. But that's really hard to do, which is why we have this. So, when a trigger involves a target, you have to demonstrate it before you pass priority. If a trigger affects the visual game state, you have to demonstrate awareness of this before it would be illegal for you to do so. So, for example, again, in the hoplite example with the counter, let's say I have a Battle-Wise Hoplite, which I also drafted last night and which was freaking awesome, and you put a Hopeful Eidolon on it, which makes it amazingly good. And so you bestow it, and then you play a land, and then you go, oh, trigger, and go to put a counter on it. Who says that's fine? Show of hands. Who says that's not fine? Show of hands. Right. We have, if the actions taken are Hoplite, bestow, play a land, oh, trigger, you've missed the trigger. There is no way the game can be arranged in such a fashion that you could play a land in between the resolution, in between the trigger event of triggering heroic and the resolution of that trigger. So, everybody clear? Basically, if when you would try to resolve the trigger, the game couldn't possibly be at that point, you've missed your chance. Please.
So, opponent attacks me with series spirit.
Sure.
And he says, okay, puts the drag test in the graveyard, says go ahead, attacks the deck box.
If you make a mistake, don't let it.
It depends.
Okay.
Don't let it
It
get you
depends.
down.
And please understand, I promise you, I'm not trying to brush you off. Things like that, especially when it comes down to physical mechanics in play of the game, it really does depend on the situation. So, if the trigger changes the rules of the game, awareness must be demonstrated at the first time the changed rule would take place. Cavalry Pegasus, for example, has a triggered ability that says when this attacks, each human creature you control gains flying until end of turn. Excuse me, each attacking human, which is important. Each attacking human you control gains flying until end of turn. This is not a trigger with a target. It doesn't say target human, it says each, which almost tripped me up yesterday. And so instead of being an ability that changes the characteristics of one card, it changes the rules of the game and says attacking creatures now have flying. So if I swing with Cavalry Pegasus and 2 other random humans, and my opponent attempts to block my humans with non-flying creatures, and I correct them and say, no, those have flying. You can't block. Have I missed the trigger? No. Excellent. That is correct. You have not missed the trigger. Now, if we go swing with my men's, you block, we play combat tricks, and then I go, oh wait, those have flying, you can't block. You've missed. Yes, this. Instead of show of hands, just thumbs down. Is there like a pit of lines you're going to throw me into? Because shit. Oh. Edit that out. Exactly.
Guy swings with Cavalry and his human, and the guy attempts to block, and he goes, okay, he gets bigger one. And the other guy goes, no, he gets flying. So he demonstrated the knowledge of the trigger, but he demonstrated the knowledge of the wrong trigger. He knew there was a trigger on the spot, but the wrong trigger. What would you have done in that situation? You knew there was a trigger for Cavalry Pegasus, but he apparently thought it was give my guy bloodthirst or something bizarre.
In that case, I would correct them on the nature of the actual trigger. I probably would not infract in that situation, but if it came to me after the fact, it would be a game rule violation. Because you've resolved a trigger, you just haven't resolved it correctly. If we were, yes, humans would definitely.
So like, speaking of bear types, you're taking
Yeah.
those humans with creatures and they're
In the situation as was described, it seems like there was awareness.
They called me right at the block.
Say what?
They called me right at declaration.
Yeah. So, if a trigger changes the game in non-visible ways, the awareness must be demonstrated the first time the trigger would be relevant. Can someone give me an example of a non-visible way in which, Kyle? Exalted. Excellent. Any others? Jace Architective. Oh my God, you are so annoying. Vicente. Sorry? Yes, frontline medic with battalion. Makes all my men's indestructible. Is very nice.
Rest in peace with nothing in the graveyard.
Rest in peace with nothing in the graveyard. Alaric. Step links, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, battle cry. Well, certain kinds of battle cry, like Hero of Bladehold has a battle cry trigger, but it has a visual representation because you put the counters onto the battlefield. Or no, that's battle cry. No, sorry, wrong one. Sorry? Yes, I'm thinking of Hero of Oxenridge. True. But I digress. So, yes, for something like, let's say, step links and landfall, this is a triggered ability with a non-visual effect on the game. So if I have a step links, play a land, crack in, and you don't block, and I say, all right, take 2, I haven't missed the trigger. I didn't say it until it became relevant, but that's okay. Sir. Right. In the context of that trigger, awareness is satisfactorily demonstrated. Because he said take 4.
It's not that like you missed the trigger because he didn't put the counter. Because the rules doesn't say that you have to actually put a counter. So it says demonstrate awareness.
Right. In that particular situation, we have demonstrated awareness of the trigger resolving. The way we have finished resolving that trigger is suboptimal, and we can fix that. Then it's the opponent's responsibility to get clarification on, you can say, what is the power and toughness of your step links right now? Or you can say in response to your land, if I want to respond to a trigger that you miss, or that you haven't acknowledged yet, I have to say, in response to this, at this time.
So they don't have to announce their trigger or notice?
Correct.
Non-visual.
It's a non-visual trigger. We are totally fine with them only demonstrating awareness when it first becomes relevant.
You're not required to it's not the burden.
Kyle, you had something?
So in this context, would it be fair to say that even if it's your opponent's triggers, you are allowed to acknowledge them if you want them to be acknowledged immediately?
Yes. If I want to acknowledge your trigger and want to do something in response to it, that is fine, but it is my responsibility as your opponent to do so. Sure.
If you genuinely feel like it's not something about the player, they play a land, you're not playing for a small trigger, and you see like a small guy come at you, you can walk, kick it, and they don't announce the trigger. You have no idea that
Both of you forgot, but he actually remembered. So I mean, sure, but when he goes to say it, you forgot, or you chose to not play hoping that he would forget. You made a suboptimal play. I think you mentioned at the beginning, you can choose to play optimally depending on the trigger you mentioned, or you can hope they forgot and essentially get a player that has it out.
Yeah. So, moving on. Sorry?
This is contextual to how do you as a judge resolve this without suggesting strategies to either player and have
You explain it as if you want to respond to a trigger that you think your opponent has missed, it's still your responsibility to indicate awareness of that trigger. Fair enough? All right. For triggers that create copies of Storm, Cypher, we automatically assume that these copies have been made. But you are still responsible for indicating awareness of the copies. So if I go Rite of Flame, Metamorphosis, Rite of Flame, Lion's Eye Diamond, Pitch It, Infernal Tutor, Burning Wish, Tendrils, then the opponent goes, okay, and I go, all right, you die. And you say, well, you didn't announce your Storm trigger. You don't have to. Same with Cypher, but nobody cares about Cypher because it was the worst mechanic in that set. For delayed triggers, they resolve automatically, but the trigger created as a result can still be missed. Okay? Do you have a Cypher question? Wait, say that again?
So if you cast a Cypher spell,
The question was, if I cast something with Cypher and I only have one creature on the battlefield, am I assumed to have remembered the trigger and targeted that? And the answer is no. So, now that we've talked a little bit about awareness and we've been talking for almost an hour. Right. If you specifically state I am exiling for Cypher, then you have demonstrated awareness of the trigger and can put it on. The delayed triggers part, if a trigger goes on the stack that creates a delayed trigger, it is assumed to have resolved automatically. But the delayed trigger that's created as a result, you can still miss that. I'll get to that in a second. Can someone give me an example of a triggered ability that creates a delayed trigger? Geist of St. Traft. Yes. Exile, yeah. When you attack with Geist, put a 4/4 angel on the battlefield, exile it at the end of combat or end of the turn or whatever it is. That is a delayed trigger. Yep, sneak attack, great one. Yep. There are many of them. We're now about 50 minutes in because I love to talk and y'all have awesome questions and thank you very much for that. But I'd like to get through remedies real quick before we wrap things up and get you on to your next seminar. So if we've gone through all the checkpoints for awareness of the trigger and we determine that the trigger has in fact been missed, then it's time to look at our options. Our first option is, does the trigger have a default action? If so, we resolve it by default. For example, sacrifice, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature if you don't lose 7 life. The default there is lose 7 life. So the question becomes, all right, so when do we resolve it by default? The answer to that is it can either be the next time a player would get priority in that step, or at the beginning of the next phase when a player would get priority. So if we realize during my draw step that I missed the trigger on Lord of the Pit, my opponent can say either, okay, we're going to resolve that now in your draw step, or we're going to put it on the stack in the beginning of your pre-combat main. If the duration for the trigger has already passed, we do this. So for example, if a trigger, 5 minutes, thank you, Tasha. So if a trigger, for example, says, when this creature attacks, I can't even, what is a trigger with a duration? Give me a trigger with a duration, somebody. Sorry? Geist-Saint Wrath. Frost Titan. When this ETB's tap, it doesn't untap during its... That's not a duration. Exalted. Yeah. So if we have an exalted trigger, well, exalted has awareness though. So, look, a trigger, Jace's. Yeah, Architect +1. Basically, if the duration for the trigger, if it said until the beginning of the next untap step, or the next upkeep step, and we just miss it after the point where it should have ended, then we just say it ended and we get on with our lives. If neither of those two things is true, then the opponent chooses whether or not we put it on the stack. If the opponent wants to put it on the stack, it can either be put where it should have been put, or if it's too late for that, on the bottom of the stack. If we do this with a trigger, and if that trigger would reference objects that were on the battlefield when the trigger should have resolved, we cannot choose objects that were not on the battlefield at that time. Good? Okay. If the trigger is detrimental, the player who controlled the trigger receives a warning. If the trigger is controlled by one player, or let's say, for example, a crow and horse, right? That's my card. I give it to you, it's your trigger. You are still responsible for remembering to give me a 1/1, and you will receive warnings for mistrigger for a detrimental trigger if you do not. Okay? Symmetrical triggers like Howling Mine, for example, can be detrimental or non-detrimental contextually. If I miss a Howling Mine trigger, it's beneficial to me, or better said, it's not detrimental to me, so I don't get a warning. But if you miss my Howling Mine trigger, then I get a warning because I forgot to tell you to draw your card. I'm sorry? Kataki and Tabernacle give triggered abilities to the cards, so the player who owns those cards controls the triggers and is responsible for resolving them properly. So, you asked about Obzadat. Obzadat says, exile this, or you may exile this. If you do, return it to play at the beginning of your next step. Yeah. That is a zone change trigger. If you miss a zone change trigger, it's the same as default actions. You can either put it on the stack right away, or at the beginning of the next phase when a player would get priority. Okay? Sorry? And that will be your opponent's decision. With that said, folks, this wraps up my Mistrigger seminar. Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much for coming.
taking control.